So in session 2, yesterday we talked about the eras of psychology. We're going to talk about people. And again, this is not an exhaustive list, but I wanted to have something down where we went over all the significant names. I tried to compile them thematically, somewhat chronologically. I mean, it's just in an order that hopefully is a nice transition. So let's start with the origins of psychology as a field. Remember, treat this as if it were Quizlet. What are the 3 or 4 bullet points that I need to know in case there's a test question on each of the following people? I left the philosophers off of this list because I'm going to talk about them in a different place. Right? They're not really psychologists, they're philosophers. So these are the famous contributors to psychology as a field. You can find this on the website. Just click on or links and documents. Click on the PowerPoint for famous psychologists. So that's where it is. So let's start with this guy. This is probably the first or origins or beginning of psychology as a science, and that's Wundt. So Wundt is the professor at the University of Leipzig in Germany, and he gets the credit of being the founder of psychology as a, let's call it a research science, right? So University of Leipzig, study of, let's call it sensory interactions, right? Sensory responses. And he had the first psychology lab. That's kind of his contribution of why he becomes famous. Then we get into the United States. We get with people like William James. William James is not on this list. I should probably add him to this list. So if you want to kind of add a little thought about William James. William James was the first sort of psychologist to make it a legitimate academic discipline, right? The first psychology program at the university level. So William James taught the first psychology class at Harvard. He wrote the first textbook that went along with that in 1890, what's known as the Principles of Psychology. So William James is the functionalist that kind of gets credit for legitimizing psychology as an academic discipline, we'll say. So he's teaching at Harvard. He admits lots of people to audit his courses, women among them, which was kind of a significant thing for the 1890s and 1900s. So enter Mary Calkins. And Mary Calkins was taking William James's psychology courses, but because of very obvious misogynism, the Harvard University denied Mary Calkins her PhD candidacy because she was a woman, right? Which is a heinous, heinous crime in 1890 or 1895, whenever it was. So she has the credit of being denied a PhD candidacy because of her gender, but she later was hired as the first female president of the American Psychological Association. So I don't know how much you would need to know about her on the AP exam, but that is her contribution to psychology, her significance. Then we get into Freud. So Freud obviously is a significant contributor to psychology. Things to know about Freud, the fact that he's a psychoanalyst. There's a couple slides here, so we'll get into the id, ego, superego dynamic, but you have to understand psychoanalysis, like we talked about yesterday, as a way to analyze the unconscious mind, right? So when you look at the metaphor that Freud gives, Freud believes that you have a conscious level of thinking, you have a preconscious level of thinking, and then you have this deep, dark, below the surface, unconscious level that's very largely unavailable to you. You're unaware of your conscious desires, your violent motives, your inappropriate sexual fantasies, the animalistic nature of the id that under the right circumstances you can tap into, right? So there's kind of some overlap with working memory here, right? Freud's idea of the preconscious mind. These are things that you know, that you can easily gain access to, like long-term memories, procedural memories, but they're not things that you're consciously thinking about. So something like knowledge or a memory, an explicit thing, can go into your conscious mind pretty quickly, right? These are things we're thinking about. But it's the unconscious mind that we want to get into. That's what psychodynamics is all about. That's what psychoanalysis is all about. How do we tap into the unconscious mind? If the desire of the ego is to protect you from these hidden unconscious things, then how do we get around the ego? Right? So to understand Freud, you have to understand the interplay of all of his theories. Now remember, Freud, most of what he wrote was not published until after he died, and most of it was published because his daughter Anna presented it to the world at large. But he did have some writings. He was being burned by the Nazis, and he was widely known in his theories even as early as the 19 teens. But Freud's contribution to psychology is the psychodynamic approach. The psychodynamic approach is understanding the inner conflicts in the unconscious mind. And the unconscious mind is a major motivator to the psychodynamic theorists. We'll get into neo-Freudians in a minute, people like Adler and Horny and Carl Jung. But what Freud believed is that you have this unconscious mind and that you have this dynamic of your personality. That your personality is really kind of this combination of motivational conflicts. That's a good buzz phrase for Freud and psychodynamics. So when you're born, you're animalistic. You have access to the id, and that's your instinctive desires, your internal drives. So it's the id is a Latin term, but I want you to think about it as if it were the ID, as if it were short for instinctive desire or internal desire, right? So I like instinctive drive or instinctive desire, right? And that's what he would refer to as the id. It's the pleasure principle. What would make me the most happy in any given moment? So as a child and an infant, you're born with nothing but desires and the desire for instant gratification. I'm hungry. Let me cry until I eat. We'll enter the ego. The ego is like the development of your persona. And the ego develops as the reality principle. And what Freud means by that is, what is the most realistic way to meet the id desires? I'm hungry. Well, I know that I can walk into the kitchen, open the fridge, and get food. That's the most realistic way to meet my desire. So that's why the ego is considered the reality principle. How do I meet my urges and needs? But something else develops through nurture, and that's the superego. The superego are those things above the desires of the self, right? Above the reality of your situation. And that's your concept of right and wrong, or if you want to call it your conscience, right? So Freud talks about this interplay between the id desires and the superego morals, right? That's a good way to look at it. So here's the problem. Understanding the unconscious, hidden inner conflicts is important to understanding Freudian psychodynamics, because there are things that the id desires that violate the superego sense of right and wrong. So what happens if you have to choose between what you want and the morality that it violates? Well, what's the ego to do? I can make this a reality, but then I would violate my principles. So this is when the ego protects itself from anxiety or guilt or depression by using what Freud calls a defense mechanism, right? So you rationalize or you project, right? You displace pent-up anger or aggression. And so here's the key behind psychoanalysis. To tap into the unconscious motivations of the mind, you have to bypass the ego. Well, why? Because the ego is protecting you from the things that you're largely unaware of. So to bypass the ego, that's where the hypnosis comes in. That's where the free association comes in. The idea is this interference, right? If you start to talk about something painful out of your unconscious mind and bring it up into your consciousness, the ego is going to push it back down, right? The ego is going to prevent you from thinking about it. It's too painful. You can't handle it. There's actually some logic to this. It's like a dissociative identity disorder, or like a dissociative fugue state. Like what happens if you become, you go through some sense of trauma and you murder your entire family. Well, now all of a sudden your mind can't handle the guilt of that, so you create some alternative reality and universe where it never really happened. Freud calls that denial. Really, it's a dissociative state, right? So there is some modern psychology and let's say therapy, right, that backs up this idea of Freudian, right, ego defense mechanism. So everything that's a defense mechanism is centered around, it's an ego tool to protect you from trauma, right, to protect you from mental, grief or guilt or anxiety. So the reason why Freud would analyze dreams is because you're unguarded when you're sleeping. So whatever manifest content that's happening in your dream is actually just a hidden symbolic storyline, right? So that's one way that you can tap into the unconscious mind, according to Freud. You can hypnotize people and hopefully they let their guard down and stop resisting what's in their unconscious mind. Free association is designed to do the same thing. So the whole point of psychodynamics or psychoanalysis is to tap into this unconscious reservoir of things, right, that are animalistic, right? So then we get into these stages. Now, if you look at this online and you pull this PowerPoint presentation up from the website, this slide is later on, and I put it with the other developmental psychologists, but I decided today to move it up in the list because it's just easier to keep talking about Freud in context. So, in the context of Freudian psychoanalysis and the unconscious motivational conflicts of decision-making, we have to talk about how the ego develops. The development of the persona, the development of the self, is this psychosexual unconscious motivation, right? This is where it kind of gets strange. This is where the neo-Freudians are lost, right? The neo-Freudians are like, not so much. So Freud believed part of your unconscious reservoir, part of this like iceberg, we'll say, was the development of the ego in stages. This comprehension of your interaction with other people. Psychosexual development. How does sexuality and gender develop in the context of the mind? Persona, we'll say. And during the stages of your life, you have this gratification need of the id. Right? The id is being gratified orally when you're a baby. Why? Because you breastfeed. That's where all of your sustenance comes from. Right? So this pent-up psycho energy or like psychotic energy is pent up in these erogenous zones or places in the body. And so as a baby, you're orally fixated, right? Or you could become orally fixated. So this fixation is something that happens later on in life. If you don't satisfy the oral gratification during your breastfeeding years, then when you go to a state of anxiety in adulthood, you might regress, as Freud calls it. One of your defense mechanisms is regressing back to that stage where you have pent-up psychic energy, right? So you still go back to this stage of being a baby where you want to be pacified orally, right? And so that's this idea that you wouldn't breastfeed necessarily as an adult, but you might smoke, right? Or you might bite your fingernails. So you're being gratified orally still. And then you get into the anal stage, and that's where children are typically potty training, right? And that's when they first become aware that when they have accidents, their parents get mad at them. So mom's chastising you for having an accident. You're supposed to be able to hold your bladder. And so now the child's feeling guilt, and they're trying to control their bladder. They become aware of their bladder. It's not that they just like piss all over themselves and they're fine with it, right? So again, the pent-up psychic energy is in the erogenous zones of expelling waste, right? He doesn't call it the genital stage because obviously that's a part of waste, expulsion, but he means genital stimulation in like a sexual sense. So in the anal stage, the pent-up energy erogenous zones are going to be things like the ability to control your bladder or the ability to control, defecating, like, going number 2, right? So this is where it gets kind of weird. So how would that manifest itself later in life? Well, Freud believed that one of those unconscious, shameful, unacceptable sexual desires might be a deviation, right? A deviant sexual desire that he believed like homosexual desires. So Freud believed that this desire to be stimulated anally is actually pent-up anal retention of psychic energy, right? So we use that phrase, anal retention, right? She's being anal retentive, or she's really anal about all the pencils being lined up. Well, that's a reference to a Freudian idea that you have pent-up psychic energy that's all trapped around the anus, right? So that's probably not something we should use as an example or a metaphor. And it's less than scientific, obviously. But that's Freud's explanation for this, is the pent-up, satisfaction anally as opposed to genitally, right? Then you get into the phallic stage, and the phallic stage is really where children start to learn gender norms. Gender identity of I'm a boy, this is what boys do. I'm a girl, this is what girls do. And a lot of people have a hard time kind of understanding that in today's society, but you have to remember, this is Victorian Vienna, Austria, Victorian Germany, Victorian England. This is Victorian Western Europe. It's very much dominated by expectations of culture and gender roles, right? So saying that there's a difference in the genders is one thing. Saying that there's a difference in the expectations of what it means as a role is something totally different, right? So we've kind of gone off the rails on that as a society. It's like we've gone from gender roles are bad, right? And they probably are, right? Somebody has this inferiority complex of not being masculine enough or not being feminine enough. Well, that's problematic. It causes anxiety. So to say that gender roles are outdated is probably a healthy and important thing. But then somehow we've fallen off the rails completely of like, gender roles are bad, gender norms are bad, aka genders are bad. Whoa, hold on. Because keep the train on the tracks. There's still a difference in the genders of people. Biologically, emotionally, psychologically, there's a difference between the two. It's not bad to be agender, right? It's bad to live in a society that places expectations based on nothing more than your gender. Those are two totally different things, right? So Freud kind of was already hinting at this gender problem, right? And this idea, what it is to become a male and female. But his is more psychosexual. His is more like, so a little boy is learning what it is to be a man from watching his father. So he's mimicking the same-sex parent, and he's competing for the attention of the opposite-sex parent. And if that isn't resolved as a healthy, mama's boy, then he can turn into this unhealthy, almost incestuous sexual relationship that he's seeking in adulthood. So why do little boys turn out to be mama's boys who marry and try to have sex with women who are very maternal? That's the Oedipus complex, right? The same thing with girls who are seeking the approval of their fathers and trying to gain the approval of older men who remind them subconsciously a lot of their fathers. It's like replacing a missing father figure with a sexual relationship with an actual father type person. It's very dysfunctional and unhealthy, right? It's not so much suggesting that 5-year-old boys have sexual desire for their mothers. They don't have sexual desire, nor do they understand it. But it's that unconscious desire to be nurtured by mom could turn into an unhealthy actual attraction to mom later on in life. That's where it becomes very problematic, right? So you get the Oedipus complex and you get the electric complex. But that's where gender identity is formed, in the phallic stage. Right? Then you get this latency period where there's really not a competition of gender. There's really not a difference between males and females. And they in our day and age, they play in co-ed t-ball and soccer teams together and they intermix, and there's really not a biological difference between boys and girls beyond their anatomy, right? Until puberty. And then puberty, all of that flares up again. You not only have gender differences and expectations, but now you have romantic attraction. And so the pent-up desire becomes genital stimulation, right? Sexual gratification. And that becomes the goal. It's kind of this idea of like you're best friends with somebody who's an opposite sex person, right? In like 5th and 6th grade, and that's your best friend, and you rode bikes together, and you played dodgeball together in PE, and spent the night at each other's houses, and then all of a sudden it's 8th grade, and you come back, and one of you like has developed physically, and it's like, whoa, what happened? How did you get boobs all of a sudden? And now your best friend from childhood has turned into a possible attractive mate, right? Well, that's the puberty effect, right? So now it goes from the latent, dormant, platonic connection to sexual attraction, right, between people. And these are all natural and normal according to Freud. It's that the pent-up, fixated energy can cause problems later in life. So that's a lot. That's a lot about psychosexual stages, but I wanted to give you a pretty good primer on that. You can read a lot more about Oedipus complexes and electric complexes and stuff like that. But that's enough to get you through on the test, right? So then we start progressing. So this Freudian stuff is kind of strange to some people. So you start getting in this age of behaviorism, right? The 1920s, the 1930s. So obviously we have to know Pavlov. You can't talk about behaviorism without Pavlov. And so Pavlov's kind of the pioneer of conditioned stimuli and unconditioned stimuli, and that's the salivating dogs. And that's a carryover, or let's say the inspiration, for Watson's work. And Watson is using Pavlov's experiments on a different scale. So he has the baby Albert experiment. He's the one that studies learned responses, that if you pair a unconditioned stimulus enough times with a neutral stimulus, then people begin to associate the neutral stimulus with the outcome, right? So Watson, you need to associate with behaviorism, you need to associate him with the baby Albert study, right? Those are the things they would probably ask you about Watson. Then we get back to some neo-Freudians. These are people around that same time period in the 20s and the 30s that were like kind of followers after Freud's theories, but they rejected some of the more controversial ideologies. One of these neo-Freudians is Adler. Alfred Adler was the one who famously instituted or posed the birth order theory. If you ever got a question about Adler, it's probably about either inferiority complexes or birth order theory. That's kind of the two significant things, right? So he believes in the dynamic of, id, ego, superego. but he rejects this idea of the psychosexual development, right? So let's take Adler a step further, right? I like this chart. I saw it online, so I stole it. Do not have the rights to, all that good stuff, right? So in the birth order theory, you have the first child. The first child is very analytical. Parents pour a lot of time, effort, and energy into child. Child is the star of the show until next child is born. Next child is trying to gain the attention, separate themselves, distinguish themselves by rebelling. Well, now there's a competition. Brother competition, sister competition, and you see this because you have siblings, right? Your teachers and your parents are like, well, your sister was always good at math, right? All this kind of stuff. So you get a competition between that child. And then, young child becomes the middle child. Middle child syndrome is the rebellion. Why? Because the star of the family has arrived, right? And you can watch TikTok videos about birth order theory that are just hilarious because you get people like the difference between your mom's reaction when the firstborn is sick, the middle child is sick, versus the baby of the family being sick, right? So it's comical, but if you're the last born child, you roll your eyes at this because you don't see it, right? If you're a middle child or a first child, you're like clapping in the back like this is scientific fact. Right, so that's Adler, right? People are motivated by this idea, and the inferiority complex is based on this compensation model. Is that if children feel as if, not even children, if adults feel as if they don't measure up, they're inferior, like let's say that a man doesn't seem masculine enough, let's say short, right, like little man syndrome, then he would overcompensate for his perceived lack of masculinity. He might drive a giant vehicle or work out a lot, right? Or go hunting and say, like, I kill animals with my bare hands and cut them open with chainsaws to get meat, right? So they're overly compensating for what they feel is an inferior or a lack of something, right? You don't tend to see that inferiority complex among women, right? Again, women are a more well-balanced, put-together species than men because they don't have this weakness complex where they have to constantly measure up to other women. In fact, there's an interesting theory out of USF that I told you before, this idea of like this masculinity as being something that's has to be earned, the masculinity card, right? And it's not this idea that women have to prove their femininity. It's just like an understood thing that it's based on biology and it's based on, but masculinity is based on a culture and that you have to earn your kind of masculinity card and you have to maintain it, right? And that's the idea that kind of like causes men complexes, right? So, but that's the idea with Adler. You have birth order theory and inferiority versus superiority. There's other neo-Freudians. We have Karen Horny, who not surprisingly bumped heads with Freud. In fact, she openly criticized the penis envy theory that Freud projected that women felt inferior to men and that they secretly desired to have a phallus or a penis, and so it was a lifelong competition to try to compensate for the fact that they didn't have a male phallus. Karen Horny, of course, said that that was nothing but misogynism, which obviously it was. And Freud said, of course you would believe that, you were a woman. What could your feeble female mind comprehend? Right, you're too busy, trying to figure out how to grow a penis. Right, and of course she says that he has womb envy. Right, it's like turn of the century trolling, social media. It's really kind of childish and comical, but it's just neo-Freudian disagreement from Freudian from policies. So that's Horny. Probably the most significant statistical and contribution-wise would be Carl Jung. If there was a neo-Freudian that you had to know on the test, I would probably say it's Adler or Jung. And Jung believes in the collective unconscious of the species of humans. Part of that is the archetypes, that there are just this symbolic characters in the human story that, things, symbolism like fire, right? And you see this in all of the ancient civilizations and stories that fire is symbolic, water is symbolic, and these are archetypes. So he believes in the collective unconscious. These are things that people don't have to learn. They're just innate, right? Like empathy is probably part of the collective unconscious. The desire to be cooperative is probably part of the collective unconscious. That you want a romantic partner and to be monogamous, that's probably part of the collective unconscious. It's instinctive, right? So that's Carl Jung. Then we start moving into kind of the mid-1900s, the 40s, 50s, and 60s. So we get humanism and personality theorists and other behaviorists So we'll just kind of intermix here chronologically. We have Gordon Alport. Gordon Alport, in some cases, is known as a humanist. He kind of fits along in with Viktor Frankl and some of these other people. But he's most importantly noted for his trait theory, right? This idea of like primary and secondary traits or cardinal traits is like these are the things that are rigid and true about your personality, and these are the things that you probably picked up from your peers, right? Mannerisms and things like that, right? So he's a personality guy. He's a trait theorist. We have B.F. Skinner. It looks like a cartoon villain in a movie, right? B.F. Skinner is Burhouse Skinner. He is the guy that invented the Skinner box or operant chamber, right? That's some kind of buzzword you might need to know about Skinner. And operant conditioning is different than Watson's classical conditioning because it's behaviors that are motivated by an outcome, right? Classical conditioning, you can learn things accidentally, right? Ow, that stove is hot, right? Ow, that stove is hot. Or like little kids, they push a button on say, a doorbell, and they hear a sound. Oh, and they push the button again, and the sound happens again. Well, very quickly they are learning it's actually me pushing this button that's causing the sound. It's classical conditioning. One thing associates with the other. Operant conditioning is different. It's like, well, I'm going to do A because B will be the outcome, right? It's not an accidental learning. It's not an innate level of associating two unrelated things or two previously unknown things that were related, right? It's this idea that like, okay, how do we train it in rats? Well, if the rat learns if I push the lever, then I will get food. So the motivation for the behavior is the outcome, right? So it's always going to be about punishments or reinforcers, right? And that's kind of based on this, and you get schedules of reinforcement. And it's, again, of course, like what happens if you put food in the box every 15 seconds? Well, that's a fixed interval of time. And the rat's not going to think, they're going to think, okay, what did I do that made it come out? Right? It's going to take them a while to figure out that it's actually a fixed interval. It's nothing that they're doing as a behavior. So operant conditioning with Skinner and Thorndike is this idea that behaviors are specifically motivated by their outcomes. So then we get E.L. Thorndike, also a student of William James at Harvard. He did most of his studies with seals or some kind of like sea marine life, teaching them to balance beach balls. He was hired by water parks. So hired by animal parks to train seals and dolphins and things like that, using his techniques, because basically he came up with this idea of the law of effect. And the law of effect is pretty simple, but to use the example of putting a cat in a box, so you have this puzzle box, or what we call an operant chamber. But if the cat is motivated by a positive outcome, a reinforcement, then the cat's going to go through the painstaking process of figuring out how to get out, right? Even if it's multiple steps. If there's nothing for the cat to gain, it'll just sit there. In fact, if you punish the cat for trying to get out, it will stop, right? So the law of effect just says that the outcome is going to reinforce your behavior. Either way, right? So if the behavior has a positive outcome, you're more likely to do it again. But if your behavior does not, or even has a punishment, you're less likely to do it again. So it's the effect of the outcome that strengthens the behavior, right? Or weakens the behavior, we'll say. So operant chambers could be Skinner, right? Or they could be in reference to Thorndike, right? Now we get into Harlow, Harry Harlow, I should say. The monkeys, just think about hairy monkeys, right? Monkeys have a lot of fur on them. So Harry Harlow is the guy at the University of Wisconsin that wanted to test whether or not rhesus monkeys, that's who he used as his test subjects. He wanted to see this in people and other species too. But his theory was that physical contact is a biological need, right? And so he studied attachment. Well, how he did that was he had side-by-side, statues of mothers, like mother monkeys. So you take a baby rhesus monkey and put them in a cage where, one of the wire statues has the nipple that represents breastfeeding, right? And that's how they're fed. But then you have, a same size statue that has fur that's soft. And so he found the rhesus monkeys needed the physical contact as much as they needed the milk. In fact, they would stop feeding and go into almost a state of depression. They would have, shutdown if they didn't have their physical contact. So it's the necessity of physical contact is what comes from the Harlow experiment with the rhesus monkeys. Speaking of animals and attachment, this is a different kind of attachment, but this is Konrad Lorenz. Konrad Lorenz was the imprinting guy. He tested various bird species and animals. What happens if you're present at birth, you spend time with these animals from birth, they imprint on you. So interspecies imprinting, right? What happens when like a cat and a pig, right, attach as a mother, almost maternal figure on a farm? Well, that's because the cat was rejected as a runt of the litter and imprinted on the pig. So the pig has now become the cat's, mother, right? So it's imprinting. So these animals follow him around religiously because he was there when they were born, bond with them, probably oxytocin in the brain, honestly, and they imprint, right? I'm going to get into Piaget, looking like everybody's sweet old grandpa, and we know Piaget used case study methods to assess how the mind developed cognitively through stages, right? So you get 4 stages: sensory, motor, pre-operational, concrete operational, and formal. And you can look at the tasks inside of those stages, like testing conservation, object permanence, egocentrism, even ideas like assimilation versus accommodation. We'll talk about those in another session. So there are documents that have Piaget stages that have the tasks in them. There's even an article that was, I think, from Psychology Today that explains examples of assimilation versus accommodation. So we'll get into that in another session. But that's Piaget, the cognitive developmental psychologist, and those are the stages. The other developmental psychologist that has stages, of course, would be Erickson. He's on the same chart. We'll talk more about him also in another session, but this idea that there are 8 stages of development. Each one of them has a psychosocial task, right? So stage 1, birth, learning who to trust. If not, you have mistrust. Stage 2, toddlerhood, being autonomous, learning how to do things on your own. Stage 3, being that early VPK to early elementary school age, and that's becoming, learning initiative on your own, or having guilt that you can't, right? Then you become the school-age kid, and that's about like your duty. What is it that I'm supposed to do, right? Industry versus inferiority. This is what I'm supposed to be, a competent person. Then you get stage 5, which is adolescence. What is my identity? If not, you get role confusion. Stage 6, which is young adulthood. You're looking for intimacy. And then stage 7 is generativity in your 30s and 40s and 50s. And then finally, at the end of your life, from retirement to death, is generativity, right, from there on. We get observational learning in people like Albert Bandura, right, see violence, model violence, and mimic violence, right? It's observational learning. So Bobo the Clown, observational learning, also social learning theory, right? Social cognitive learning theory. Ainsworth is secure versus insecure attachments. That's like babies that freak out when their kids are gone. They don't have a secure attachment. You want a securely attached child, right? Of course, they're going to be sad when mom leaves, right? If you babysit kids, you know that happens even in healthy kids. I say healthy, well-adjusted kids, but eventually they get over it. And by the time you're down the driveway or down the street, the kids should be distracted and on to something else. Might even not want mom to come back because they're having so much fun. But children who are insecurely attached cannot be away from their mother. They cling to their mother. They have stranger anxiety, right? So that's Ainsworth. Lawrence Kolberg is an interesting one. It's this idea of morality, right? Pre-conventional versus conventional versus post-conventional morality, right? There's actually 6 stages. There's 3 phases. So let me go to the next slide. And it's this idea that little kids don't really make moral choices. That's what Kolberg says. They make choices based on what he calls pre-conventional morality, right? So what is it? I'm doing what I'm supposed to do, right? This is me doing the right thing. High five, look at me, right? So my 4-year-old daughter, my youngest child, if Lincoln gets in trouble for something, she comes walking into the room. She goes, I didn't do that. High five, go away, right? Because she's basically flaunting the fact that she did what she's supposed to do. In other words, is she making a moral choice? No. She's being rewarded for the fact that she's doing what she's supposed to do. So why do little kids do the right thing? Because it gains them positive attention. It's reinforced, right? So then you get this conventional phase, and that's like late, like middle school, late elementary, middle school, and probably early high school. This idea of like, you want to be a good kid, this is what good kids do. And then you get to this idea of like, well, this is what I'm supposed to do, because if I don't, I'll get in trouble. Like, hey, Tim, do you want to cut class today? No, they'll catch us, I'll get in trouble. That's not a moral choice. That's a choice based on an outcome. And then you become this post-conventional person where in your young adulthood, well, I'm not going to cheat on my taxes. I'm not going to steal and kill and rob, because that's what makes society go. It would be chaos. We need order, right? And then you get to this point in your life where you have actual ethics and principles and you do things based on an actual moral choice, right? So that's Kolberg. Bombrin is a popular one. You always ask about the parenting styles. And again, this is not abuse. This is just levels of involvement, right? Right. So Bombrin has this scale of like absentee parents, like what happens if you have a parent that works all the time and they're busy, maybe they're not meeting the needs of the child, whether it's like actual physiological needs or emotional needs, then Bombrin would consider that parent to be negligent. But then you get permissive parents. Permissive parents also don't create well-adjusted kids because permissive parents don't create healthy boundaries from their kids, and the kids don't really know what's appropriate and what's not. So when they go out into the world as adults, they're like, Mom used to really tell me what's okay, and they're always calling their parents, and is this bad, is this good, right? They're not very independent. They're codependent, right? So permissive parenting is not necessarily like unhealthy, but imagine if you get the dynamic between two parents, they split up, let's say, and you get good cop, bad cop. One authoritarian parent, right, is strict and like overbearing, and then you have one permissive parent. Well, what's going to happen? The kids are going to want to stay with permissive parent, and it throws off the whole dynamic of things, right? So really how it's supposed to work is you should have this dynamic of this increasing level of permissiveness. When you're a little child, being an authoritarian is probably the appropriate way to parent you. You don't need free will choices when you're 7. Your parents don't need to build in you this independent educate, like, well, you should be able to make your right choices. I want them to live, their truth and walk on their path. Well, that's insanity because they're 7. They need to be told what to do, when to do it, and there will be consequences if they do not. You should treat your 5, 6-year-olds like drill sergeants. Well, I'm not going to do that, coach. That's abuse. And that's why your children will be terrors. And that's why millennials are raising children that are terrors, because they were raised as terrors by their Gen X parents who destroyed America. Why? Because the self-esteem movement. There's really not a whole lot of parenting science, and Bombrin will back this up, to show you that the self-esteem movement is actually beneficial for you. You don't need to grow up thinking the sun shines out of your ass. You need to grow up learning how to deal and become an independent adult. Self-esteem comes from competency. You have to feel loved and nurtured, but you also have to be transitioned into adulthood. So you probably should have authoritarian parents when you're young, but they should become increasingly more permissive as you get older. From the time that you drive and then become a voting citizen, you probably shouldn't have authoritarian style parents, right? Because then it just creates resentment. As soon as I get out of here, I'm not going to have to listen to you, Dad, and your rules. And kids from authoritarian households who have overbearing parents don't tend to have great relationships with their parents after adulthood. Kids from authoritative households do, right? The parents have created boundaries, they correct bad behaviors, but they're flexible and they're open and honest with their kids, right? So that's the parenting styles. Carol Gilligan, she has major contributions to this idea of like femininity and the nurture gene of kids. She's like tracing genomes of girls, right? She's probably not real statistically significant on the test. Not to say that her studies weren't significant at all, but from this purpose. Then you have the James Lange theory of emotion versus the Cannon-Bard theory of emotion. The Cannon-Bard theory is like, well, what happens first? The recognition of the stimulus or the comprehension of the emotion, right? So the physiology and the awareness happen at the same time in Cannon-Bard, and they don't. In James Lange, it's like, okay, well, this happened, sensory stimulus. I evaluate that I am now afraid, right? So it's your like awareness of the physiological, right? So within a human being, a response to experiences in the world, the autonomic nervous system creates physiological events such as muscular tension or a rise in heart rate, perspiration, and dryness. Emotions then are the feelings which come about as a result of the physiology of the changes. In the Cannon-Bard theory, it happens at the same time and it's indistinguishable, right? So again, simultaneously. Think about two cannons firing simultaneously. We get Albert Ellis. Albert Ellis is the guy that invented REBT. I don't know that you would need to know that, but that's who he is. Maslow, we're getting into the humanists now, the hierarchy of needs. You know Maslow, increasingly psychological from physiological needs, which are the most important at the bottom. Carl Rogers, unconditional positive regard, active listening. This is the client-centered approach to therapy that really humanism came from, right? Tell me how you're feeling about this. I'll edify your feelings. I'll repeat things that you say, help you feel like you can help yourself, right? Unconditional positive regard, active listening, empathy, humanism. Martin Seligman, also a humanist, learned helplessness with the dog study. Positive psychology, really, he gets credit for. He's still alive and has a bunch of kids, and the positive psychology school at the University of Penn is actually named after him. Alfred Binet, we know. Now we're getting into intelligence theories. He created this idea of IQ and the intelligence quotient for placing kids in school. Louis Turman adapted Alfred Binet's original IQ test so it could be used in American settings in American schools. That's what became known as the Stanford-Binet test. We get into Charles Spearman would back up Binet's idea that there is one type of intelligence, low intelligence, average intelligence, or high intelligence, and that these skills are all sort of clustered together. Smart people are good at lots of things. Less intelligent people are not adept at a lot of things. It's the opposite of multiple intelligence. So Gardner, 8 intelligences, intelligence is multiple. You can be high in musical abilities but low in mathematical skills. That points to things like savant syndrome as evidence for multiple intelligences. David Wechsler creates the Wechsler Intelligence Test, Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale, the WAIS, and then it was adopted for kids, Wechsler Intelligence Scale for children. Sternberg is the guy that I tend to identify with the most. There's 3 factions to intelligence: that you can be practically smart, which is your street smarts, your ability to delegate tasks, etc. Your academic smarts, which is your ability to do well in school, and then you have creativity, right? That there's different factions to your intelligence. Then we get into modern linguists. We get Noam Chomsky, the ability that there is some innate biological genetic thing that allows humans to be able to speak. So that's linguistic development. Phineas Gage, what changes in the brain, right? Case studies, personality in the frontal lobe. This was the case study that led to the theory that your personality is housed in the frontal lobe and that not memories or other processes, because he lost none of that, right? Broca, the association area in the left frontal lobe that allows verbal speech with your mouth. That's opposed to Wernicke. Karl Wernicke discovered the part of the temporal lobe, right on the surface, that is your ability to distinguish and decipher language patterns, right? So if we're talking about aphasia, the inability to form words after a stroke, it's Broca. If we're talking about the inability to distinguish language patterns, it's Wernicke, right? Rorschach, the inkblot test. This is kind of a psychoanalytic, it's projective, right? A projective test, like look at this, tell me what you think, and it's supposed to like project what's in your subconscious mind. Like, oh, I see a very angry elephant, and that's supposed to tell us something about the latent content of my unconscious mind, right? Inkblot test, it's the Rorschach test. Kubler-Ross, this is not so much psychology as it is, well, I mean it is psychology, but not so much psychology as the field of development. It is the stages of grief, right? You go through denial, then you get angry, you start to bargain, take me instead, right? Then you go through depression, and then finally you accept it and you begin to move on, right? Elizabeth Loftus is significant. Memories are connectionism. They are recreated. So if they're recreated, they can be manipulated, so you get false memories and the false memory effect, the false consensus effect, and the fallibility of eyewitness testimony. Then we get into people like Milgram, obedience, the electric shock experiment that he did at Yale. How far would people go to obey an authority figure and hurt a stranger? Which leads us to Zimbardo, the Stanford prison study of like situational versus dispositional attribution. People take on the roles of their situation. Not so much that they're bad people, but they're put in a bad situation, the Lucifer effect. And finally, Solomon Asch, the conformity experimental theorist that says that people will give in to peer pressure, right, for line segments. And that's the end of that. So tomorrow we will get into anatomy.